interested in continuing their education, going to a four-year academy, or as they soon became known, secondary schools. And then anyone older than that went to university. Previously, it was not unusual to have like 14-year-olds going to university. The dawn of the 20th century saw these secondary schools, which were once mostly private things for rich kids, get gradually incorporated into the standard public school system that all kids were expected to go through. Child labor laws, as well as a transition away from a mostly farm-based economy, all helped contribute to a growing consensus that children should stay in school until around age 18 or so. The teenagers produced by the big American baby boom that followed World War II are often seen to have been an unprecedentedly fortunate generation, the first who were able to enjoy a stable and comfortable adolescence, uninterrupted by wars or depressions. They were also the first to be targeted as a particular consumer demographic with unique tastes and wants. Early post-war American entertainment featuring teenage characters tended to avoid telling stories about school because that was considered boring. Instead, they had them doing fun stuff like having parties on the beach. By the 1980s, however, the boomer teenagers were now old enough to make their own movies, and many of them saw high school as a very important and very particularly American institution that was a critical part of telling the story of what it was like to grow up in the modern United States. Sometimes this was done for laughs, with movies like Porky's or Fast Times at Ridgemont High, depicting high school as this ridiculously awkward place full of horny idiots. And sometimes the portrayal was more thoughtful, with the movies of John Hughes in particular being widely celebrated for using high school as a metaphor through which some of the deeper tensions in American society could be explored, particularly class. The late 80s and early 90s similarly saw growing interest in teenager-centered TV shows that took place in a high school setting. These could either be mostly serious, like Canada's own Degrassi High, or more goofy and lighthearted, like Saved by the Bell. It's worth noting that a lot of these depictions of high school tended to be rather anachronistic and dated, however, as they were often the products of men in their 30s trying to recreate memories of what their lives were like 20 years ago. So you have like kids wearing modern fashions but still hanging out at the ice cream parlor. As high school themed entertainment became a more common part of American life, it likewise inevitably began to develop its own cliches, with a stable roster of heroes and villains and conflicts that you would see over and over again. You see a lot of this reflected in the Battle Wizard cast of characters. The rich prick, the stoner, the alpha bitch, the bully, the demonic principal. In the late 2000s and beyond, movies like High School Musical or shows like Glee reflected a growing willingness on the part of writers and directors to just unapologetically use all of the Hollywood high school cliches in a kind of playful, post-ironic way, openly embracing the obviously phony and stylized nature of the setting, but still using it as a way to tell interesting or relatable stories about teenagers, even if they weren't terribly realistic. And that is what I would say this game is all about. It's mining a rich vein of American culture, comprising a highly recognizable medley of stereotypes, satire, and nostalgia for things that only ever half existed. Alright, so let us take a look at some of these cards. There are a lot, and while I would love to analyze each and every one with you, I wasted too much time on that intro, so let's get to it. So as you saw, a lot of the game's character cards involve stereotypical depictions of members of various teenage cliques, with the existence of cliquish subcultures, of course, now being taken to be one of the defining characteristics of the high school experience. This grotesque fellow embodies high school jock culture, but more specifically football culture, with football being by quite a large margin America's most popular high school sport. According to the National Federation of High Schools, nearly 70% of all American high schools have a football team of some sort, and in any given year, America is home to over 1 million high school football players. Now, a character like this obviously plays into the stereotype that all football players are violent, muscle-bound ogres, but what's interesting is that when you study the history of high school football, it is less of an example of jock culture infiltrating the schools from outside than something that explicitly grew out of them. American-style football is a modified version of British rugby that basically originated in late 19th century universities in the United States and Canada for the purpose of providing gentlemanly contests to determine whose school was better, a topic of enormous concern to the rather narrow slice of the American elite who attended college in those days. And since they were once quite elite institutions themselves, early American high schools pretty consciously modeled themselves after American universities and incorporated a lot of the same traditions. So it didn't take long before high schools started creating their own football teams to play against rival high schools, just like the universities did. The supposed oldest rivalry in American high school football, in fact, between New London High and Norwich Free Academy, two schools in Connecticut, dates back to 1875, the same year that Harvard first played against Yale. Now, sports remain one of the few realms of American life that are still rigidly gender segregated, some might even say gender normative, and the fact that girl students historically never played football helped lead to the emergence of a distinct female student subculture that rose up around the footballers: cheerleaders. These days, cheerleaders are considered a real paragon of American femininity, celebrated in everything from pop songs to porn. But this is a relatively new development, and for a long time, cheerleading was not considered a particularly feminine thing at all. Riling up audiences before a big game is nothing new, but initially it was mostly done by charismatic male students who would do acrobatic tricks and comedy routines and stuff, which only made sense because you do have to remember that for a long time, girls dancing was considered a somewhat scandalously erotic activity to a lot of people, and thus not necessarily something a school would want to do in front of a bunch of uptight parents. Social mores started to change in the 30s and 40s, with female dance numbers slowly becoming a bigger part of cheerleading performances at colleges and high schools. But by far, the vast majority of the tropes and aesthetics that we associate with modern-day female-centric American cheerleading can be attributed less to an organic evolution than the imposed ideas of a single man. Lawrence R. Herkimer, a former male cheerleader from Southern Methodist University, who in 1948 founded the National Cheerleaders Association. Old Man Herky's organization is a good example of something being in the right place at the right time. At precisely the moment that girls were starting to get more interested in cheerleading, the NCA was there to offer training camps and dance moves and uniforms. Basically, every single cliche that is now ubiquitous with American cheerleading, from the pleated skirts to the pom-poms to jumping like this, was dreamed up by Mr. Herkimer, who the New York Times recently mourned as simply Mr. Cheerleader. All right, so here is another character that I thought was kind of funny. Advisor Adderall, who you can see is so tweaked out that his brain has jumped out of his head. Adderall is a mass market prescription amphetamine introduced in 1996 that has risen to become a hugely popular drug among American high schoolers because of the way it is said to help kids with attention problems stay focused on their schoolwork. It is not a coincidence that the first three letters of Adderall are ADD. The joke of this character is that he is some sort of student counselor type who is pushing pills like a crazy man, which is an allusion to something that has actually become a pretty serious topic of conversation in American high school culture these days. Using amphetamines to treat behavior problems among students is very common in the US and Canada, in a way it is not common in other countries. In theory, this is because in other countries, the teenagers don't have the same sort of attention problems as they do here, but that conclusion has always invited skepticism as to whether or not the real problem is just that we have too many overzealous school administrators, like our friend over here, who are too quick to diagnose attention problems in students, whose parents in turn are too quick to treat them with pills.
It showed patients who are prescribed amphetamines like Adderall had a slightly higher risk of developing psychosis compared to those who received other types of ADHD medications.
Speaking of parents, this is a fun character as well. The Tiger Mom. You can see she's mauling the kid for getting an F. This whole idea of the Tiger Mom was first popularized in a 2011 book called Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother by the conservative Yale professor Amy Chua, who made the argument that ultra-strict parenting is the only proven way to get good results out of your kids, even though it is not politically correct to say so anymore.
You take the generation of Americans who pulled themselves out of the Great Depression. How do you think those people parented? I don't think their main concern was being service providers for their kids and arranging play dates. For them, parenting was about instilling a work ethic in their children and a sense of respect and responsibility.
The term Tiger Mom was originally intended to evoke a certain archetype of the strict Asian American parent, in contrast to the more wishy-washy white parent. But I would say